10 courtrooms where evidence, power, and public judgment changed legal history. This countdown moves from number 10 to number 1, with each archive leading into the next. We begin with Trial of Socrates, the trial that changed the rules. The trial of Socrates, 399 BC, was held to determine the philosopher's guilt of 2 charges against the city of Athens, asabeia, impiety, and corruption of the youth. The accusers cited 2 impious acts, failing to acknowledge the gods of the city, and introducing new deities. The death sentence of Socrates was the legal consequence of asking politico-philosophic questions of his students, which resulted in the 2 accusations of moral corruption and impiety. At trial, the majority of the dicasts, male citizen jurors chosen by lot, voted to convict him of the 2 charges. Then, consistent with common legal practice, they voted to determine his punishment and agreed to a sentence of death to be executed by Socrates drinking a poisonous beverage of hemlock. The judgment surrounding trial of Socrates lead to Nuremberg trials, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 9, Nuremberg trials, the trial that changed the rules. The Nuremberg trials were international criminal trials held by France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States against leaders of defeated Nazi Germany for plotting and carrying out invasions of several countries across Europe and committing atrocities against their citizens in the Second World War. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany invaded many countries across Europe, inflicting 27 million deaths in the Soviet Union alone. Proposals for how to punish the defeated Nazi leaders ranged from a show trial, the Soviet Union, to summary executions, the United Kingdom. In mid-1945, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States agreed to convene a joint tribunal in Nuremberg, occupied Germany, with the Nuremberg Charter as its legal instrument. The judgment surrounding Nuremberg trials lead to International Military Tribunal for the Far East, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 8, International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the trial that changed the rules. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, also known as the Tokyo Trial and the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, was a military trial convened on April 29, 1946, to try leaders of the Empire of Japan for their crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity, leading up to and during World War II. The IMTFE was modeled after the International Military Tribunal, IMT, at Nuremberg, Germany, which prosecuted the leaders of Nazi Germany for their war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. Following Japan's defeat and occupation by the Allies, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, United States General Douglas MacArthur, issued a special proclamation establishing the IMTFE. The judgment surrounding International Military Tribunal for the Far East lead to Sacco and Vanzetti, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 7, Sacco and Vanzetti, the trial that changed the rules. Nicola Sacco, Italian, Nicola Sacco, April 22, 1891 to August 23, 1927, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, Italian, Bartolomeo Vanzetti, DZ, June 11, 1888 to August 23, 1927, were Italian immigrants and anarchists, controversially accused of murdering Alessandro Berardelli and Frederick Parmenter, a guard and a paymaster, during the April 15, 1920, armed robbery of the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company in Braintree, Massachusetts, United States. 7 years later, they were executed in the electric chair at Charlestown State Prison. Most historians consider their conviction unfair due to prejudice against immigrants and radicals. After a few hours' deliberation on July 14, 1921, the jury convicted Sacco and Vanzetti of first-degree murder and they were sentenced to death by the trial judge. The judgment surrounding Sacco and Vanzetti lead to Scottsboro Boys, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 6, Scottsboro Boys, the trial that changed the rules. The Scottsboro Boys were 9 African-American male teenagers accused of raping a young white woman and a 17-year-old white girl in 1931. The landmark set of legal cases from this incident dealt with racism and the right to a fair trial. The cases included a lynch mob before the suspects had been indicted, all-white juries, rushed trials, and disruptive mobs. It is commonly cited as an example of a legal injustice in the United States legal system. On March 25, 1931, 24 people were hoboing on a freight train traveling between Chattanooga and Memphis, Tennessee. The judgment surrounding Scottsboro Boys lead to Linebaugh kidnapping, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 5, Lineburg Kidnapping, the trial that changed the rules. On March 1, 1932, Charles Augustus Lineburg Jr., born June 22, 1930, the 20-month-old son of Colonel Charles Lineburg and his wife, aviator and author Anne Morrow Lineburg, was murdered after being abducted from his crib in the upper floor of the Lindberghs' home, Highfields, in East Amwell, New Jersey, United States. On May 12, the child's corpse was discovered by a truck driver by the side of a nearby road in adjacent Hopewell Township. In September 1934, a German immigrant carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested for the crime. After a trial that lasted from January 2 to February 13, 1935, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The judgment surrounding Lineburg kidnapping led to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 4, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the trial that changed the rules. Julius Rosenberg, May 12, 1918 to June 19, 1953, and Ethel Rosenberg, née Greenglass, September 28, 1915 to June 19, 1953, were an American married couple who were convicted of spying for the Soviet Union, including providing top-secret information about American radar, sonar, jet propulsion engines, and nuclear weapon designs. They were executed by the federal government of the United States in 1953 using New York State Execution Chamber in Sing Sing in Ossining, New York, becoming the first American civilians to be executed for such charges and the first to be executed during peacetime. Other convicted co-conspirators were sentenced to prison, including Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who had made a plea agreement, Harry Gold, and Morton Sobel. The judgment surrounding Julius and Ethel Rosenberg led to Ravonia trial, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 3, Ravonia trial, the trial that changed the rules. The Ravonia trial was a trial that took place in apartheid-era South Africa between the 9th of October 1963 and the 12th of June 1964, after a group of anti-apartheid activists were arrested on Liliesleaf Farm in Ravonia. The farm had been the secret location for meetings of Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the newly formed armed wing of the African National Congress. The trial took place in Pretoria at the Palace of Justice and the Old Synagogue. Men who were convicted and sentenced to prison for their activities included Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, Dennis Goldberg, Raymond Mlaba, Elias Motsoaledi, Andrew Mlangeni. The judgment surrounding Ravonia trial led to Eichmann trial, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 2, Eichmann trial, the trial that changed the rules. The Eichmann trial was the 1961 trial of major Holocaust perpetrator Adolf Eichmann, who was captured in Argentina by Israeli agents and taken to Israel to stand trial. Eichmann was a senior Nazi Party member and served at the rank of Obersturmbannführer in the SS, and was primarily responsible for the implementation of the final solution. He was responsible for shipping Jews and other people from across Europe to the concentration camps, including managing the shipments to Hungary directly, where 564,000 Jews died. After the end of World War II, he fled to Argentina, living under a pseudonym until his capture in 1960 by Mossad. The judgment surrounding Eichmann trial led to trial of Charles I, where another courtroom tested the reach of law. At number 1, trial of Charles I, the trial that changed the rules. The trial of Charles I took place in January 1649, marking the first time a reigning monarch was tried and executed by his own subjects. Following years of conflict during the English Civil War, which pitted the royalists loyal to Charles I against the parliamentarians seeking to limit his powers, the king was captured by parliamentary forces in 1646. In November 1648, after a series of failed negotiations and increasing tensions, the Rump Parliament established the High Court of Justice to try Charles for treason. The court was presided over by John Bradshaw, and the proceedings were marked by controversy and legal disputes, as many questioned the legitimacy of trying a king. That was top 10 trials that changed the rules. Every story in this countdown began as a shorter archive, but the connections only appear when the files are placed together. Subscribe for the next collection.